Imagine you are drifting on the River Thames.
Right in the heart of the city.
Exactly. But it is the dead of night, and the water around you is just black as pitch.
Oh, yeah, completely dark.
It's swirling with this oily, unnatural thickness that actually seems to pull at the oars of your small rowboat. It's late, and the fog has rolled in thick and heavy off the mudflats.
You can barely see a thing in that kind of fog.
Right. The gas lamps on the distant shore are just these sickly, dim halos suspended in the haze. You can't hear the bustling city of London anymore.
It's just you and the water.
Yeah, you can't hear the carriage wheels on the cobblestones. You can only hear the heavy, wet slapping of the river against the wood of your boat. And then, out of nowhere, a massive, silent shadow bears down on you.
Oh, that is terrifying.
A towering wall of iron slicing through the mist with no warning, no sound of engines.
Yeah.
Just the sheer, terrifying inevitability of a collision.
It really is the ultimate nightmare, of isolation and vulnerability. Because the terror stems from the contrast. You are surrounded by civilization, floating right through the heart of the world's most powerful empire during the Victorian era.
Right.
Yet you are utterly, completely helpless. The river in the dark just strips away all the protections of the modern world.
That primal fear, that visceral dread of what lurks in the fog of the Thames, it's birthed its fair share of legends over the centuries.
Oh, absolutely.
Countless legends.
Yeah, in fact, if you dig into the folklore of the river, looking through old sailors' yarns and dockside ghost stories, you will eventually stumble across a very strange, very eerie tale.
The ghost ship.
Yes, the supposed 1903 mystery of a ghost ship called the Alice.
Right.
The story goes that this ship was found drifting aimlessly in the middle of the Thames. She was fully rigged, her sails were perfectly set, her hull was completely undamaged, but there was not a single soul on board.
Just completely empty.
Yeah, a phantom ship, right in London's primary waterway, just floating silently in the mist.
I mean, it is a fantastic story. It's absolutely dripping with Gothic atmosphere. Oh, for sure.
But as we comb through the historical records, the maritime logs, and the port authority documents of the era, we have to systematically dismantle it.
We have to ruin the fun.
Yeah, unfortunately. Because the 1903 ghost ship Alice is almost certainly a myth. Or, well, more accurately, it is a psychological distortion of real events.
Okay, so what actually happened?
There is simply no record of a crewless ship by that name drifting in the Thames in 1903. What we are likely seeing here is the conflation of a couple of factual maritime notes that have been, twisted by time.
Like a game of telephone over decades.
Exactly. First, there was a real 19th century ship named the Lady Alice Kenless, which was launched in 1867.
Okay.
But she wasn't a mysterious phantom. She was just a standard cargo vessel that was later converted into a suction dredger.
Not very spooky.
Not at all. And her remains were ultimately found in the River Devon, not drifting crewless on the Thames. But far more importantly, the name Alice carries a very heavy, deeply traumatic weight on the Thames.
Right. Which brings us to the real story.
Yes. The myth of the drifting ghost ship is almost certainly a psychological echo of a far more terrifying and very real historical disaster.
It's like I said, maritime telephone. True horrors, especially ones that involve massive, sudden loss of life and unimaginable human suffering. They're sometimes just too unbearable for the collective consciousness of a city to hold on to in their raw, bloody state.
They have to soften it somehow.
Exactly. Society morphs them. Over the decades, a brutal, visceral tragedy softens into a spooky, romanticized ghost story about an empty ship in the fog. It just makes the horror manageable.
It turns a nightmare of screaming and drowning into a campfire tale.
Yeah, we sanitize the trauma by turning it into folklore. But our mission for this deep dive is to strip away the folklore entirely.
No more ghost stories today.
Right. We are going to look at the unvarnished, factual horror of what actually happened on the dark waters of the River Thames. We are going back to the evening of September 3, 1878.
And we really need to set the stakes for you listening right now. We are not talking about a minor incident here.
No, not at all.
Or, a small ferry tipping over. The sinking of the SS Princess Alice remains, to this very day, the greatest loss of life in any British inland waterway shipping accident.
It's staggering when you look at the numbers.
It is. We are talking about an estimated death toll of somewhere between 600 and over 700 men, women, and children.
Over 700 people.
Yeah. And it didn't happen over hours. It happened in a matter of minutes on what was supposed to be just a routine, joyous pleasure cruise.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to rewind the clock to a bustling Victorian London, a city practically vibrating with industrial power just hours before two fundamentally different worlds are about to smash into each other in the dark.
To truly comprehend the scale of this tragedy, we first need to understand the vessel that carried these people and what she represented to the people of London.
The Princess Alice.
Yes, I want to look closely at the SS Princess Alice. This was not some dilapidated, forgotten ferry boat. She was the absolute pride of the Thames pleasure fleet.
I was looking at her background in the sources, and her origins are quite prestigious. She was a paddle steamer built back in 1865 up in Greenock, Scotland.
By a highly respected firm, right?
Yeah, Carrying Company. She actually began her life operating under the name Bute up in Scotland before she was brought down south to the Thames.
And she was a big ship for a river.
Definitely. We're talking about a substantial vessel here, just over 219 feet long, weighing in at 432 gross registered tons. She was eventually purchased by the London Steamboat Company and renamed after Queen Victoria's third child, Princess Alice.
Her prestige really cannot be overstated. When we look at the social history of the Thames in the 1870s, the Princess Alice was the pinnacle of maritime leisure.
She carried royalty, didn't she?
She did. In 1873, when the Shah of Persia made a highly publicized royal visit to England, out of all the ships available, the Princess Alice was chosen to carry him up the river to Greenwich.
Wow.
For years afterward, working-class and middle-class Londoners affectionately referred to her as the Shah's boat. She was a floating symbol of Victorian progress.
And she was supposed to be incredibly safe.
Yes, she had been continuously upgraded, fitted with brand new boilers, and crucially, she possessed 5 watertight bulkheads, which were considered state-of-the-art safety features at the time.
The Board of Trade loved her.
They did. They had certified her as incredibly safe, legally permitting her to carry up to 936 passengers in calm inland waters.
But I want to clarify something for the listener. How do watertight bulkheads actually work? And why did they matter so much to the Victorian public?
It is a really crucial piece of engineering context. A watertight bulkhead is essentially a vertical wall inside the hull of the ship, dividing the interior space into separate compartments.
Like rooms in a house.
Exactly. The idea is that if the ship hits a rock or suffers a collision that breaches the hull, the water will only flood the specific compartment that was damaged.
So the whole ship doesn't fill up with water.
Right. The bulkheads contain the water, preserving the overall buoyancy of the ship so it doesn't sink.
That makes sense.
In 1878, telling the public that a ship had 5 watertight bulkheads was the equivalent of telling modern passengers that an airplane has redundant computer systems and multiple backup engines. It projected this aura of absolute invulnerability.
Which makes the reality of what happened so much more chilling. I want to paint a picture of the scene on the afternoon of September 3rd, 1878.
Set the stage for us.
The London Steamboat Company had billed this specific journey as a moonlight trip, and it was a spectacular bargain.
Very affordable for regular people.
Yeah, for just 2 shillings, an ordinary family could purchase a ticket to take this massive, beautiful steamer from Swan Pier, right near London Bridge, all the way down the river to Rosherville Gardens in Kent and back again.
And Rosherville Gardens is a fascinating cultural phenomenon in its own right.
I'd never heard of it before reading the sources.
It was constructed in an abandoned chalk pit, actually transforming an industrial scar into a lush, sprawling pleasure garden. It was the premier entertainment destination for Londoners seeking an escape from the smog of the city.
It sounds kind of beautiful.
It was. It featured open-air theaters, bear pits, massive dancing platforms, archery ranges, and just beautifully manicured walking paths. It was, in many ways, the Victorian equivalent of a modern theme park.
So you have all these families, shopkeepers, clerks, and laborers dressing up in their absolute best clothes for a rare day out. And Victorian fashion, especially for women, was incredibly heavy.
Oh, incredibly heavy.
We're talking crinolines, bustles, multiple layers of thick wool and heavy cotton, tightly laced corsets. Even the men are in heavy woolen suits and boots.
They are completely weighed down by their clothing.
Totally. So they spend the entire day at Rosherville Gardens, dancing, drinking, watching shows. The atmosphere is completely festive.
Everyone is just having a great time.
Yeah, by the time the Princess Alice begins her return journey toward London, around 6:30 p.m., the sun is starting to get low, a band is playing on the wooden deck, children are running around playing games. It is a scene of pure, innocent leisure.
It is the absolute antithesis of a horror story.
But underneath that festive veneer, a fatal administrative decision had been made earlier in the day.
Right, the ticketing system.
Yeah, well, first the ticketing, but also the crew. Let's talk about the ticketing first, because the sources reveal that the ticketing system for these excursions created a massive, catastrophic blind spot.
Yes. Because the London Steamboat Company owned a large fleet of vessels operating on similar routes, their ticketing was highly flexible.
Meaning you could just get on whatever boat showed up?
Pretty much. A passenger could buy a ticket for the Princess Alice, miss their departure, and simply hop on the next steamer. Alternatively, they could ride a different ship down to the gardens and take the Princess Alice back.
Which is great for customer service.
Very convenient for the consumer, but it meant that absolutely no passenger list was kept. The crew had a rough idea of the head count based on the visual crowding of the decks, but there was no manifest.
None at all.
None. No one on Earth knew exactly who or precisely how many people were on board the Princess Alice as she steamed back toward London. Estimates suggest there were over 700, perhaps close to 800 people crammed onto her decks and down in her luxurious below-deck saloons.
And then there's the issue with the crew. The ship's master was a 47-year-old man named Captain William Grinstead. He was a respected mariner, but he made a choice that day that seems utterly baffling in hindsight.
A truly fatal error.
He allowed his regular, highly experienced helmsman to stay behind at Gravesend, effectively giving him the evening off. And to replace him at the ship's wheel, Grinstead brought up a seaman named John Ayers.
The inquiry records highlight this as a critical failure. John Ayers was a seaman, yes, but he had very little experience navigating the complex, highly trafficked tidal waters of the Thames.
It's not an easy river to steer.
No, and more importantly, he had almost no experience standing at the helm of a 219-foot-long paddle steamer. Steering a vessel of that length requires an intimate understanding of how the ship responds to the current.
Right, the delay when you turn the wheel.
Exactly, the delay in the rudder's action and the specific quirks of the vessel's handling. Ayers simply did not possess that muscle memory.
I have to ask, because this just boggles my mind, how common was that? Could a captain really just casually swap out a critical bridge crew member, the person literally steering the ship, with an inexperienced deckhand, on a vessel carrying 700 or 800 passengers?
It is a shocking revelation about the era, but yes, it was unsettlingly common. The regulatory framework of the 1870s was dangerously loose.
It's wild to think about.
Today, the maritime industry is governed by incredibly strict licensing, mandatory rest periods, and rigid staffing protocols. You cannot simply hand the wheel of a passenger ferry to an untrained crewman.
Obviously.
But in Victorian England, the prevailing attitude was still heavily reliant on the unquestioned authority and individual judgment of the ship's captain. There was an implicit trust in the gentlemanly conduct and instinct of mariners, rather than stringent, legally enforced protocols.
So they just trusted the captain to know best.
Yes. And the Thames was a chaotic superhighway. You had thousands of individual watermen in small wooden rowboats, massive international cargo ships bringing goods from across the empire, and these floating pleasure palaces all sharing the exact same tidal river.
It must have been so crowded.
It was. The rules of the road existed, but enforcement was minimal, and individual captains frequently improvised based on the tide, the weather, or just personal convenience.
So, to summarize the situation moving west up the river, we have the Princess Alice. She is a lightly built wooden superstructure paddle steamer. She is heavily overloaded with hundreds of exhausted, happy passengers in heavy clothing.
And she's being steered by an inexperienced helmsman.
Exactly. And coming from the exact opposite direction, moving east down the river, we have a monster. The SS Bywell Castle.
The contrast between the two vessels is just jarring. The Bywell Castle was an entirely different species of ship.
She wasn't carrying passengers.
No, she was a heavy industrial iron collier built in Newcastle in 1869. While the Alice was 432 tons, the Bywell Castle was a staggering 1,376 gross registered tons.
Over 3 times the size.
Yeah. She was over 254 feet long, with a massive depth of hold reaching 19 feet. She was not designed for comfort. She was a brutal, efficient machine, designed to haul thousands of tons of coal across the open ocean.
The sources mentioned she was fresh out of dry dock in Millwall, too, right? Newly repaired and freshly repainted.
Ready for a long journey.
Under the command of Captain Thomas Harrison, she was heading up the eastern coast to Newcastle to load her holds with coal. And from there, she was bound for a long voyage to Alexandria in Egypt.
A global workhorse.
Exactly. This wasn't a local pleasure craft. This was a heavy piece of global logistics, a floating iron fortress.
And because Captain Harrison was primarily an open ocean mariner and was unfamiliar with the specific shifting intricacies of navigating this enclosed, highly congested stretch of the Thames at night, he made a very prudent decision.
He brought on a pilot.
He hired Christopher Dix. Dix was a highly respected veteran Thames River pilot with 34 years of experience navigating these exact waters. He knew every mudbank, every eddy, and every current.
So they had the best guy available.
They did. Legally, Harrison was not required to hire a pilot for this specific stretch of the outward journey, but he wanted the absolute best expertise available on his bridge.
But despite having a 34-year veteran guiding the ship, there is a terrifying structural reality to the Bywell Castle. She was built with a raised forecastle.
That elevated front section of the upper deck near the bow.
Right, and because of this massive iron architectural design, pilot Dix, standing back on the ship's bridge, literally could not see the water directly in front of his own ship.
He was driving blind, essentially.
He had a massive built-in blind spot extending straight ahead into the darkness.
The mechanics of this blind spot are critical to understanding the impending disaster. Think of driving a massive commercial truck where the hood is so high you cannot see a small car driving 10 feet in front of your bumper.
That's a great way to picture it.
To compensate for this structural flaw, Pilot Dix had to rely entirely on a seaman positioned at the very front of the bow. This lookout's entire job was to peer into the darkness and shout back directions or warnings to the bridge.
Just a guy shouting.
Yeah, in an era before radio communication, the safety of the vessel depended entirely on a man shouting over the roar of the wind and the engines.
If we pull back and look at the bigger picture, the tension is almost unbearable. You have these two floating worlds on a collision course.
Completely different worlds.
One is a light wooden pleasure steamer, overloaded with humanity, treating the river like an extension of a theme park. The other is a heavy, iron-hulled industrial behemoth with severely compromised forward visibility, treating the river like a factory floor.
Moving towards each other at a combined speed that leaves almost zero margin for error.
And the sun has just gone down.
The environmental canvas of this disaster is the final fatal ingredient. By the time the Princess Alice surrounds Tripcock Point and enters a long, relatively straight stretch of the river called Galleon's Reach, it is between 7 to 7.40 in the evening.
Right, and sunset that day was officially recorded at 6:42 p.m.
So the twilight has completely faded. It was pitch black.
And the official maritime log from the Bywell Castle notes that the weather is, quote, a little hazy.
I really want to emphasize the psychological reality of navigating a major river in 1878. We take modern technology for granted today.
Oh, absolutely.
Today, a ship has radar that can see through fog. It has GPS mapping every inch of the waterway. It has VHF radio to communicate with every vessel in a 10-mile radius.
Powerful searchlights, too.
Right, lights that can turn night into day.
Right.
In 1878, none of that existed. Your entire awareness of other vessels that could weigh thousands of tons and crush you in an instant came down to looking for 3 primitive oil lamps.
It's terrifying to think about.
A dim red light on the port side, a dim green light on the starboard side, and a single white masthead light. You are piloting a massive structure of metal or wood through the hazy darkness by looking for the equivalent of a distant, flickering candle.
The Bywell Castle, guided by the veteran pilot Dix, is moving steadily downriver, heading east toward the open sea. She's moving at about 5 knots, which is roughly 6 miles an hour.
A steady pace.
Yeah, and she's generally maintaining a safe, predictable course right down the center of the deep river channel.
Meanwhile, the Princess Alice is coming upriver, heading west back into the heart of London. And she is fighting a strong outgoing tide. The water is pushing against her.
Which is making the journey harder.
Exactly. And this is exactly where the fatal mistake occurs. Captain Grinstead, standing on the bridge of the Alice, makes a navigational decision based on traditional, everyday waterman knowledge. He decides to seek out the slack water.
Okay, we need to clarify this mechanically. What exactly is slack water, and why would a captain risk altering his course in the dark just to find it?
It comes down to fluid dynamics and fuel efficiency. In a tidal river like the Thames, the current is always strongest in the deep channel right in the center of the river.
Where the Bywell Castle is.
Right. But as you move closer to the muddy banks, the physical friction of the shoreline and the shallower bottom slows the water down. This creates pockets of less resistance, which mariners call slack water.
So it's easier to sail through.
Yes. If you are steering a paddle steamer against a strong, heavy tide, staying in the center means your engines have to work at maximum capacity just to make slow progress. But if you move out of the center and steer into the slack water near the riverbank, you face far less resistance.
You save coal, you save time.
Exactly, and you make the journey much smoother for your passengers.
It makes sense in theory. It's exactly like driving a car on a highway into a massive howling headwind. If you can pull out of the fast lane and duck behind a long row of trees or a sound barrier on the shoulder, the wind resistance drops, and the car doesn't have to work as hard. You're just using the environment to your advantage.
That is an excellent analogy. Seeking slack water was a completely normal, everyday practice for Thames boatmen. It was considered good seamanship.
But not tonight.
No, in this specific instance, on this specific night, with the haze settling over the water and an inexperienced helmsman at the wheel, it was a death sentence. Because the slack water Grinstead wanted was on the south side of the river.
So he had to cross the river.
To reach it, the Princess Alice had to physically alter her course and steer away from the center. And that alteration brought her directly across the bow of the massive, iron-hulled Bywell Castle.
Standing on the bridge of the Bywell Castle, Pilot Dix is peering into the dark. Suddenly, he sees the dim red port light of the Princess Alice approaching.
Just that tiny red glimmer.
Right. Now, according to the maritime rules of the road, when two ships approach each other head-on, they're supposed to pass port to port, meaning they both steer slightly to the right and their left sides pass each other safely.
Think of it as the center line on a highway. Without it, you have absolute chaos. The water doesn't have painted lines, so ships rely on an absolute, unshakable agreement that if we meet, we follow the rule.
It's the only thing keeping them safe.
It is the only thing preventing disaster in the dark.
But suddenly, the red light of the Princess Alice veers. She breaks the rule. She cuts right across the center of the river, attempting to cross the Bywell Castle's path to reach the southern bank.
The geometry of this moment is horrifying. The Princess Alice places her long, vulnerable wooden broadside perfectly perpendicular to the forward path of the Bywell Castle.
She forms a T.
Yes, she is effectively forming a T shape in the water. Pilot Dix, with his 34 years of experience, instantly recognizes the catastrophic geometry of the situation. He doesn't hesitate.
He tries to stop.
He shouts immediate orders to the engine room to stop the engines and throw them into reverse at full speed.
But here's where the physics of the situation seal the fate of everyone on board. You cannot just hit the brakes on a 1376-ton iron coal ship.
You absolutely cannot. The inertia of a vessel that size is immense. Inertia is the physical resistance of any object to any change in its velocity.
So even with the engines reversing?
Even with the massive propellers suddenly spinning in reverse, churning the water backward, the forward momentum of 1,376 tons of iron displacing that much water simply cannot be halted.
It just keeps sliding forward.
The ship does not stop. It continues to slide forward through the darkness, an unstoppable mass of iron bearing down on a highly vulnerable wooden structure.
The surviving accounts of those final seconds read like a scene from a nightmare. You have to imagine being a passenger on the Princess Alice. You are out on the open deck.
Listening to the music.
Yeah, the band is still playing a cheerful waltz. People are laughing, leaning against the wooden rails, exhausted from a long day of dancing. And then, out of the pitch-black haze, this towering, solid black wall of iron simply appears, looming over the deck.
Unimaginable terror.
There is no time to run. There's no time to even understand what you were looking at. Up on the bridge, Captain Grinstead finally realizes the fatal error of his maneuver.
Too late.
He leans over the wooden rail of his doomed ship, staring up at the giant iron prow about to crush them, and he screams across the dark water, "Where are you coming to? Good God. Where are you coming to?"
It is the desperate, agonizing cry of a man realizing his own mortality and realizing he has doomed hundreds of people all in a single shattering instant.
And then the impact.
At a precise angle of 13 degrees, the iron bow of the Bywell Castle strikes the Princess Alice on the starboard side right in front of the massive wooden paddle box.
The sound of the impact must have been deafening. We aren't talking about two modern steel ships denting each other.
No, not at all.
The heavy, sharp iron prow of the collier acted like an axe. It sheared right through the light wooden structure of the pleasure cruiser. It violently sliced the Princess Alice completely in two.
The structural failure was absolute and instantaneous. Remember those 5 watertight bulkheads we discussed earlier?
Right, the state-of-the-art safety feature.
They were completely rendered useless. Bulkheads only work if the damage is localized to one compartment while the rest of the hull remains intact. But when a ship is physically severed in half, the structural integrity of the entire vessel is obliterated.
The water just pours in everywhere.
Water rushes in from the massive gaping wound across all compartments simultaneously.
The Princess Alice did not sink slowly. There was no time for the crew to hand out cork lifebelts. There was no time to lower the lifeboats in an orderly fashion.
It was immediate panic.
There were no brave musicians playing on the deck as the ship slowly slipped beneath the waves over hours, like the Titanic. The ship was functionally annihilated on impact.
Just torn apart.
As the hull split apart, the heavy cast-iron boilers tore loose from their mountings, crashing through the remaining woodwork and plunging into the river, dragging the wreckage down faster.
The weight of those boilers alone would pull it down.
Exactly. Within 4 minutes of the impact, the Princess Alice had completely vanished beneath the surface.
4 minutes. That is the window between life and death for over 700 people.
I want you to just pause and absorb the terrifying speed of that disaster.
Yeah.
You are dancing to a band, you hear a screech of wood and iron, the deck violently drops out from under your feet, and before your brain can even process what is happening, you are submerged in the pitch-black river.
It's hard to wrap your head around it.
But, and this is the point in the story that elevates this from a tragic maritime accident into a pure psychological horror documentary, the water they fell into was arguably worse than the crash itself.
We have to talk about the true horror of the Thames in 1878. The Princess Alice did not sink in the clean, salty, open ocean water of the Atlantic.
No, she didn't.
She sank at a very specific, incredibly dangerous location on the river. She went down exactly at the site of London's massive sewage outfall pumping stations at Abbey Mills and Crossness.
Here is where the story gets really interesting and deeply horrifying. A few decades earlier, London had suffered from what was called the Great Stink.
Oh, the smell was famously bad.
The river in the center of the city was so polluted with human waste that Parliament couldn't even function due to the smell. So they hired an incredibly brilliant engineer named Joseph Bazalgette to build a massive, revolutionary underground sewer system to save the city from cholera.
And Bazalgette's system was indeed a marvel of Victorian engineering. It captured the waste of millions of people and funneled it away from the wealthy center of London.
But there was a catch.
A huge catch. The critical flaw in the system, the flaw that would doom the passengers of the Princess Alice, was that the sewage was not treated. It was not filtered or purified.
They just moved it.
The system simply moved the problem. It pumped the raw sewage further downstream to the industrial outskirts of the city and dumped it, completely raw and untreated, directly into the Thames at Barking Creek and Crossness.
And the timing of the collision is a cosmic, incredibly cruel joke. Exactly 1 hour before the Princess Alice was sliced in half, the tide had turned.
The worst possible time.
Right on schedule. Those pumping stations had opened their massive iron gates. 75 million imperial gallons of raw, untreated, fermenting human waste had just been dumped directly into the water at Galleon's Reach.
The contemporary accounts of the water quality at that exact location are genuinely stomach-turning. A chemist writing an investigative report for the Times newspaper shortly after the disaster described the precise nature of the water the passengers fell into.
What did he say?
He wrote, and I quote, "2 continuous columns of decomposed fermenting sewage, hissing like soda water with baneful gases, so black that the water is stained for miles, and discharging a corrupt charnel house odor."
Hissing like soda water. The water was literally bubbling and foaming with toxic, noxious gases releasing into the air.
It's just vile.
And it gets worse. It wasn't just raw human waste. This specific area of the river was an unregulated industrial dumping ground. There was highly acidic, untreated chemical runoff pouring continuously into the river from the massive Becton gas works and several local chemical manufacturing factories lining the banks.
It really forces us to analyze the sensory experience of the victims in those 4 minutes. They were not just drowning in water.
No.
They were violently plunged into a thick, suffocating chemical sludge. The immediate physical reactions would have been paralyzing. The acidic water would have blinded them instantly upon contact with their eyes.
Oh, God.
The baneful gases bubbling off the surface would have burned their lungs as they gasped for air. The sheer density and viscosity of the liquid made swimming incredibly difficult, draining the stamina of even the strongest swimmer in seconds.
And to add one final layer to this hellscape, earlier that very same day, there had been a massive fire at a petroleum storage facility further upriver on Thames Street.
Another industrial accident.
Yeah, thousands of gallons of fresh oil and petroleum had poured into the Thames to extinguish the blaze. That oil had floated downstream on the tide and was resting right on the surface of the water at Galleon's reach.
So it's sewage, acid, and oil.
So the passengers of the Princess Alice are cast into the pitch black, splashing frantically in a bubbling mixture of raw sewage, burning chemical acid, and a thick, suffocating slick of petroleum.
Now imagine the human struggle to survive in that environment. As we noted, hundreds of the passengers were women and children. The fashion dictates of 1878 required heavy, voluminous clothing.
Those big dresses.
Yes, the moment those layers of wool, thick cotton, and corsets hit the water, they rapidly absorbed the heavy, oily sludge. The clothing instantly transformed from fashion into lead weights.
If you couldn't swim, and the vast majority of working-class people in Victorian London had never learned how, you were dragged down beneath the surface instantly by the sheer weight of your own clothes.
It was inescapable.
But for the people who were trapped inside the ship when it split apart, the horror is almost unfathomable.
The source documents detail what is undeniably the most chilling, psychologically devastating aspect of the entire disaster. The fate of the passengers who had gone down into the luxurious saloons below decks to escape the evening chill.
The people trapped inside.
Yes. Out of the hundreds of people who were down there drinking tea and talking when the collision occurred, only 2 survived.
Only 2 people made it out of the saloons.
Only 2. Days later, when a salvage diver in a heavy canvas and brass suit was sent down into the murky black wreckage to assess the state of the sunken hull, he found a scene frozen in absolute terror.
What did he see?
He reported to the authorities that the narrow doorways leading out of the saloon and up to the deck were completely, solidly jammed with bodies. When the hull split and the water began violently rushing in, the passengers had panicked. In the sudden pitch blackness, they rushed the narrow stairwells.
Just a stampede in the dark.
They crushed frantically against each other, creating a desperate, impassable human bottleneck.
I want you to put yourself in that pitch-black sinking saloon for just 10 seconds. Try to imagine the sensory overload, the sudden violent jolt that knocks you off your feet.
The lamps breaking.
The oil lamps shatter, instantly plunging the room into absolute darkness. You hear the deafening roar of wood splintering and iron grinding. And then the rushing roar of foul, freezing, toxic water pouring in from the ceiling above you.
Absolute nightmare.
You scramble to your feet in the dark, you run for the stairs, but there are 50 terrified people ahead of you screaming, completely jammed in the wooden doorframe. You push, but you can't move forward.
And you can't go back.
The weight of the crowd prevents you from moving back. The foul water is rising rapidly past your knees, to your waist, to your chest, your neck. The absolute suffocating claustrophobia. The realization that you are trapped in the dark and there is no way out.
The salvage diver reported that he found them trapped upright. They died standing up, wedged together, crushed in the dark as the sewage filled the room.
It is just a visceral, terrifying reminder of the chaotic, brutal reality of shipwrecks. We often romanticize maritime disasters in films, focusing on acts of heroism or tearful goodbyes.
Like the Titanic string quartet.
Exactly. But the reality is sheer panic-induced physics. It is the biological imperative to escape, leading to a crush of bodies in the dark. While hundreds were dragged down into that toxic tomb below, an equally desperate, chaotic struggle was unfolding on the surface of the river.
Up above in the haze, it was pure pandemonium. The crew of the Bywell Castle immediately realized the magnitude of what had just happened. Captain Harrison and his men didn't run away.
They tried to help.
They did everything they physically could. They frantically dropped thick mooring ropes over the high sides of their towering iron ship, hoping people thrashing in the water below could grab onto them in the dark.
They threw everything they could find overboard.
They threw down a heavy wooden cargo hold ladder. They tossed planks of wood, lifebuoys, chicken coops, anything that would float.
And they lowered a boat, too.
They did. They even managed the incredibly difficult task of lowering their own heavy wooden lifeboat down into the darkness.
Yeah.
Those Bywell Castle crew members rode directly into the hissing, toxic sludge, pulling desperate people over the gunwales, managing to save 14 lives. And it wasn't just the crew of the collier. Local Thames boatmen and laborers working late shifts at the factories on the banks of the river who heard the deafening crash and the chorus of screaming in the dark ran to their small rowboats and launched themselves into the pitch-black water to try and save whoever they could find.
Through sheer, desperate effort, about 130 people were pulled alive from the water that night. But there was a heartbreaking near miss that haunts the history of this event.
The Duke of Teck.
Yeah, the Princess Alice had a sister ship, the Duke of Teck, which was steaming up the river on the exact same route, just 10 minutes behind her. If the collision had happened 10 minutes later, or if the Duke of Teck had been just a little faster, her crew might have been able to illuminate the water and save hundreds of people.
It's agonizing to think about.
But by the time the Duke of Teck arrived on the scene, the screaming had stopped. The river was silent. The Alice was gone. They were entirely too late to save anyone struggling in the water. They only arrived in time to take the traumatized survivors off the deck of the Bywell Castle.
And we must emphasize a grim, deeply tragic medical statistic regarding those 130 survivors. Being physically pulled from the river and placed on a solid deck did not mean you were safe.
Because of what was in the water.
Because of the horrific pollution, the concentrated raw sewage, the industrial acids, the petroleum, the water itself was lethal. The historical medical records note that 16 of the rescued survivors died within 2 weeks of the sinking, simply from the biological trauma of ingesting the toxic water.
Awful.
Their internal organs were poisoned and infected from the inside out. Dozens more suffered severe chronic respiratory and gastrointestinal illnesses for the rest of their lives.
It's just relentless. The horror doesn't end when you get out of the water.
Yeah.
And while the survivors are lying in hospital beds, vomiting up river mud and dying of severe infections, a completely different nightmare is beginning to unfold on the shore.
The family's finding out.
News of the sudden, catastrophic sinking hits the telegraph wires. Panic instantly rips through the heart of London.
You have to contextualize this within the era. There are no cell phones to text your loved ones and ask if they are okay. There are no rolling news channels broadcasting a list of survivors.
You just know the ship sank.
You just know your husband, your wife, or your children went on a beautiful pleasure cruise, and a stark telegram arrives at the local post office saying the ship has been sliced in half and hundreds are dead.
Desperate relatives start swarming Swan Pier in central London, demanding information that the steamboat company simply doesn't have. Others rush to the train stations, taking the very first trains out to Woolwich Arsenal, which was the closest major port and military installation to the wreck site.
And what those grieving families found when they arrived at Woolwich was a logistical and bureaucratic nightmare that compounded their trauma. Because the River Thames itself formed the legal boundary between different counties, West Kent on the south bank, South Essex on the north bank.
Oh no, so different jurisdictions.
Exactly. The bodies being pulled from the river were subject to entirely different local legal jurisdictions.
It was pure chaos. There was no central morgue. There was no organized disaster response team. Bodies were just being dragged out of the mud by local boatmen and laid out in whatever space was available.
Anywhere they could find room.
They were stored in local town halls, tool sheds, and dockyard warehouses on whichever side of the river they happened to wash up on. So you have these terrified, weeping families wandering endlessly between different makeshift morgues, crossing back and forth over the Thames on ferries,
walking down rows of corpses,
lifting canvas sheets off hundreds of bloated faces looking for their loved ones.
This disorganized, chaotic recovery effort also gave rise to a deeply macabre microeconomy. The local river police and authorities were completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the dead.
They couldn't handle it themselves.
So they effectively outsourced the grim task of body recovery. They hired local Thames watermen to row out and search the mudbanks. They paid them a base rate of £2 a day, but crucially, they offered a financial incentive. A 5-shilling bounty for every individual corpse they recovered and brought to the authorities.
A literal cash bounty on the dead.
Yes. And this financial incentive, introduced to men who lived in desperate Victorian poverty, led to scenes of profound grotesquerie on the water. These watermen were literally fighting each other on the river over the floating corpses.
That is so dark.
There are documented accounts of men in rowboats using sharp iron boat hooks to violently rip bodies away from competing boats, fighting over a corpse just to claim the 5 shillings.
It is a stark look at human nature at its absolute darkest. Desperation breeding completely callous behavior. And the bodies they were fighting over, I mean, the condition of the dead was horrifying.
The unique environment of the river drastically accelerated the horror. The high concentration of raw sewage, the corrosive industrial chemicals, and the unusually warm September weather meant that human decomposition happened at an astonishing, highly unnatural pace.
The corpses being pulled from the water were bloated to completely unrecognizable proportions. They were covered head to toe in this thick, foul-smelling, oily slime that the mortuary workers found almost impossible to wash off.
And their clothes were ruined too.
Even the heavy clothing of the victims began to rot rapidly. The colorful fabrics severely discolored and bleached by the chemical acids in the water. It was profound psychological trauma, for any family member who had to walk through those sheds to identify them.
Which makes the broader public reaction to the disaster even more unsettling to modern sensibilities. As the tide went out over the next few days, the broken, shattered sections of the Princess Alice became clearly visible, resting in the thick mud banks.
People could see it from the shore.
And instead of treating this area as a sacred site of mass death, the Victorian public treated it as a massive spectacle.
Thousands of sightseers swarmed the area. They didn't come to help, they came to gawk. They physically fought each other for better vantage points on the shoreline.
Enterprising boatmen started charging people to row them out to the wreck at low tide.
It's just sickening.
And these sightseers were physically ripping pieces of splintered wood, brass fittings, and torn fabric off the shattered hull to take home and put on their mantelpieces as souvenirs. The local authorities actually had to draft in 250 extra policemen just to form a cordon and hold back the morbid crowds.
It's a fascinating, if deeply disturbing, aspect of Victorian culture. The era was characterized by an intense, almost obsessive relationship with death, mourning, and tragedy.
Very much so.
But to see it manifest as a physical struggle, to steal a splinter of wood from a ship where 700 people had just suffocated in sewage, it highlights a profound disconnect between the reality of the horror and the public's desire for macabre entertainment.
It really does. You have people risking their own lives diving into toxic sludge to save total strangers on the night of the wreck, and just days later you have people buying boat rides to steal a piece of a mass grave.
Two sides of the same coin.
It's human nature showing both its absolute most heroic and its most deeply grotesque faces simultaneously. And naturally, once the initial shock of the disaster begins to settle, the grief turns to anger. The public and the authorities demand one thing.
Someone must be blamed for this.
This leads us into the legal labyrinth that followed the disaster. The search for accountability was severely complicated by the sheer scale of the event and those overlapping county jurisdictions we mentioned earlier.
You essentially had two coroners running parallel, completely separate legal inquests at the same time. You had Coroner Charles Carter running the inquest for West Kent, where most of the bodies were brought.
And Coroner Charles Lewis handling the jurisdiction for South Essex on the opposite bank.
Right, and Lewis was trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare. He basically had to formally identify the bodies on his side, issue the legal burial orders, and then physically ship the paperwork and remains over the river to Woolwich so Coroner Carter could attempt to run a centralized inquest.
Carter was faced with an impossible task, so he made a very pragmatic, if unusual, legal decision. Instead of attempting to run 600 separate inquests for every single victim, which would have taken years, he focused the entire legal investigation on the very first positively identified body, a man named William Beechey.
A proxy for everyone else.
Yes. Carter instructed his jury that whatever verdict they reached regarding the specific cause of William Beechey's death would legally apply to all the victims of the disaster.
But getting to the truth of how Beechey died meant figuring out exactly how the ships collided. And the witness testimonies were a complete mess. You had dozens of Thames boatmen, passengers, and crew members taking the stand, and absolutely nobody could agree on what actually happened in the dark.
So many conflicting stories.
Some boatmen swore the Alice got caught in a rogue tidal eddy that forcefully pushed her into the Bywell Castle's path against the captain's will. Then the chief mate of the Princess Alice took the stand and flatly denied that his ship had ever altered its course at all, which completely contradicted the physical geometry of the crash.
It is a textbook example of why, in any disaster of this magnitude, eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. The sheer trauma of the event deeply distorts memory.
People's brains just can't process it accurately.
The darkness and the haze obscured clear vision. And crucially, the intense self-preservation instinct encourages survivors, especially the surviving crew members, to subconsciously or deliberately shift the blame to avoid facing criminal negligence and manslaughter charges.
And this leads to a part of the inquiry that is slightly ridiculous but perfectly illustrates just how messy human memory and sobriety can be during a catastrophe. During the inquest, the media focus suddenly shifted to a man named George Purcell.
Ah, yes, Purcell.
Purcell was a stoker who worked down the hot engine room of the Bywell Castle. Right after the crash, while the ships were still dealing with the immediate aftermath, Purcell went around the docks loudly telling anyone who would listen that his captain and the entire bridge crew of the Bywell Castle were dead drunk when the collision happened.
It was a massive, scandalous accusation that the Victorian press immediately seized upon, splashing it across the front pages.
But then, the coroner puts George Purcell under oath on the witness stand in a formal court setting. And suddenly, his story completely changes.
He backs down.
He sits there and says, "Oh no, everyone on the bridge was completely sober. I never said they were drunk. I have no memory of ever saying that." And then other crew members take the stand and reveal the embarrassing truth. The only person on the Bywell Castle who was completely hammered that night was George Purcell himself.
It highlights the extreme danger of latching onto initial rumors and dockside gossip in the wake of a tragedy. The inquiry had to painstakingly sift through these layers of public panic, individual self-interest, and blatant intoxication to find the actual structural and navigational failures that caused the wreck.
So after weeks of contradictory testimony, what did the legal system actually decide? Because there were multiple verdicts handed down by different bodies.
Yes, the legal conclusion was deeply fractured. The coroner's jury, which consisted of 19 local men, came back with a nuanced, though slightly contradictory verdict. They primarily placed the blame on the Bywell Castle.
Stating that Pilot Dix and Captain Harrison didn't stop in time.
Right, that they did not stop and reverse their engines in time to prevent the collision. However, the jury also added that the Princess Alice contributed to her own demise by not halting her own engines.
And they added some other notes too, right?
They attached several scathing addenda noting that the Alice was vastly overcrowded, dangerously undermanned, and lacked sufficient life-saving equipment for the passengers she carried.
But the Board of Trade, which is the actual maritime authority with deep technical knowledge, ran their own inquiry at the exact same time. And they came to a completely different conclusion.
The Board of Trade was strictly concerned with the rules of navigation and the mechanics of the collision. They found that the Princess Alice, under the command of Captain Grinstead, had definitively breached Rule 29, section of the Thames Conservancy Regulations.
A port-to-port rule?
By attempting to cross the center of the river to seek out that slack water, Grinstead had completely failed to pass port to port. Therefore, the board placed the blame solely and entirely on the Princess Alice, stating the Bywell Castle, given her mass and inertia, could not possibly have avoided the collision once the Alice crossed her bow.
And because human nature demands financial compensation, the two shipping companies took the matter to the High Court of Justice. The London Steamboat Company sued the owners of the collier for £20,000, claiming their ship was destroyed by negligence.
And the countersuit.
The Bywell owners countersued for £2,000 for the damage to their iron bow. And after 2 grueling weeks of maritime lawyers arguing in the High Court, the judge basically threw his hands up and said, "You're both at fault." He ruled that both vessels shared the blame for failing to take adequate evasive action in the fog.
This endless legal squabbling over money and fault feels deeply hollow when contrasted with the visceral physical reality of the aftermath. Because the bodies decompose so rapidly in the toxic heat, many of the victims could never be visually identified by their families.
So they had to do mass graves.
On September 9th, just days after the crash, thousands of people attended a massive public burial at Woolwich Cemetery. Unidentified coffins, marked only with chalk police numbers, were lowered into a mass grave.
The public outcry over the tragedy was immense. The Lord Mayor of London opened a Mansion House fund to collect public donations, and it raised £35,000, which was an astronomical sum of money in 1878, to help support the hundreds of widows and orphans left destitute by the disaster.
But if we look at the long-term historical legacy of the Princess Alice, we see that the sheer horror of the event actually forced Victorian London to rapidly modernize. The visceral public disgust over the horrific condition of the bodies finally broke the decades-long political gridlock regarding the river's pollution.
So they finally stopped dumping the sewage.
The Metropolitan Board of Works realized they could no longer treat the Thames as an open sewer, dumping raw sewage at Barking and Crossness.
They commissioned a fleet of specialized sludge boats, and fittingly, the very first one was named the Buzzell Jet. Instead of dumping the waste directly into the river where people lived and worked, these boats loaded the effluent and shipped it far out into the deep waters of the North Sea to be dumped.
A huge change for the city.
It was the crucial beginning of the end for the Thames acting as an open, toxic sewer.
Furthermore, the disaster completely revolutionized policing and emergency response on the river. The coroner's inquest exposed the fatal flaw that the Marine Police Force, who were responsible for securing the Thames, were still entirely reliant on heavy wooden rowing boats.
Which is useless in a mass emergency.
You simply cannot manage a mass casualty event, pull hundreds of people from the water, or police massive iron steamships with men slowly pulling oars in rowboats. The government was finally forced to provide the river police with modern steam launches, drastically improving their speed and emergency response capabilities on the water.
The disaster also fundamentally killed the popularity of Thames pleasure cruising for a generation. The psychological trauma was so deep, and the public association of the river with dark, suffocating death was so strong that the London Steamboat Company eventually went bankrupt.
People just didn't want to sail on the river anymore.
Londoners simply stopped viewing the river as a place for a fun, carefree evening out.
The legacy of the Princess Alice is one of profound tragedy leading to necessary reform. But there is one final, incredibly eerie loose end to this entire narrative. A historical coda that brings us full circle to the myths, the ghosts, and the legends we started with at the beginning of this deep dive.
The ultimate fate of the Bywell Castle. The towering iron beast that survived the collision, the ship whose massive prow sliced the Alice in half.
5 years after she destroyed the Princess Alice in the dark waters of the Thames, the Bywell Castle was on a routine voyage, carrying a heavy cargo of cottonseed and beans from Alexandria, Egypt, heading back to Hull in England. It was January 1883.
And she was in bad waters.
She was steaming through the Bay of Biscay, a notoriously treacherous, volatile stretch of water off the western coast of France.
And a massive, howling gale blew in off the Atlantic.
The Bywell Castle sailed straight into the heart of that storm and was never seen again. She vanished completely. There was no wreckage ever found. There were no distress calls. And there were no survivors.
Wow.
All 40 crew members on board, including the veteran sailors who had desperately pulled the drowning passengers of the Alice from the toxic sludge of the Thames 5 years earlier, were lost to the sea.
So what does this all mean? The Princess Alice sinks in a highly congested, narrow river right in the heart of civilization, witnessed by thousands of people, leaving a legacy of mass graves, toxic horror, and endless legal paperwork.
And the Bywell Castle just disappears.
The Bywell Castle vanishes in the open ocean, swallowed whole by the water without a single trace. It is a staggering, terrifying reminder of the sheer, uncompromising power of the water and the absolute vulnerability of human beings the moment we step off solid earth.
It reminds us that whether it is a calm, muddy river running through a city or a raging deep ocean during a storm, the water is a fundamentally alien environment. We build massive iron fortresses and beautiful wooden palaces to traverse it, but we are only ever visitors there.
Just tourists, essentially.
We are always just one steering error, one structural blind spot, one heavy fog bank away from catastrophe.
Every single modern maritime safety regulation we take for granted today, every strictly enforced passenger capacity limit on a commuter ferry, every mandated annoying lifeboat drill you have to sit through on a cruise, every orange life jacket tucked neatly under your seat, all of those rules are written in the blood of the 700 men, women, and children who went down in the dark, toxic waters of the Thames that night in 1878.
Never forget why those rules exist.
The next time you step onto a pleasure boat and you hear the safety briefing that you usually ignore, or you casually glance at the emergency exit signs, take a moment to look over the rail at the dark water below you. Remember how quickly a floating party can turn into a suffocating tomb?
Yeah.
And remember the Princess Alice.
The water remembers, even when we choose to forget.